Hi guy, welcome back TV spoilers. Mariah wasn't being hunted by a visible enemy. She was being cornered by the most terrifying thing of all, a voice inside her head. Wearing Ian Ward's face clearer, louder, heavier with every passing hour. Like destiny tightening its grip. In recent days, Mariah had lived as if she were walking across a fragile bridge over an abyss. Each breath forcing her to choose between holding on and letting go. She knew she was trapped. She knew fear was tearing through her thoughts layer by layer. Yet what pushed her toward collapse wasn't only pressure or guilt, it was the feeling that every exit had been locked from the inside. Ian's hallucination didn't need a door to open or a room to darken. It only needed a moment when Mariah blinked too long, or when Dominic's cry echoed in her memory. Ian didn't arrive with brute force. He arrived with patient cruelty, bending Mariah's logic inch by inch. Turning her love for Dominic into a chain, turning motherhood into a verdict. And because he wrapped it in the language of nobility, he became even more dangerous. Mariah began to see herself as a burden. As a threat Dominic would pay for if she stayed alive in this broken state. Outside, the world kept moving, but inside Mariah, time flowed differently, warped, heavy, unforgiving. She no longer trusted simple reassurance. And she no longer knew if she could separate her own thoughts from the ones Ian planted. The hallucination slipped into every crack when Mariah tried to calm down. Ian called her calmness proof that she was pretending when she panicked. He called it the naked truth she could no longer deny. He built a sealed narrative where Mariah was the source of danger, and death was the only clean solution that could keep Dominic safe. Mariah was pulled into a ruthless spiral of reasoning. If she disappeared, Dominic wouldn't be contaminated by her instability. If she vanished, everyone would finally stop being afraid. If she stopped existing, Ian would lose his reason to haunt her. Each argument landed like a nail, pinning her to the floor of her own mind. And the most frightening part was that her resistance didn't weaken. Because she wanted to it weakened because she no longer had the strength to live with the belief that she was a hazard. Even as Mariah slid deeper into despair, one thin thread still held her. And that thread was Dominic. Mariah loved him with a love that both saved her and tortured her. Dominic was the reason she forced herself upright each morning. But he was also the reason her fear became infinite. Because anything tied to him could be twisted into pressure. Mariah began to see every part of herself as risk, a hug held too tightly, a second of distraction, a strained smile. Ian turned it all into evidence that she would ruin her child's life. When the mind sinks far enough, the person stops feeling like they're choosing. It feels like they're being guided toward a conclusion that was written before they even opened their eyes. And Ian's greatest cruelty was using love as a weapon. Forcing Mariah to choose between keeping Dominic close and protecting him from herself. While Mariah isolated herself inside that closed, airless world, Abby began to feel an unease that ran cold along her spine. She didn't need proof to know something was wrong. It came from the smallest details, unusual gaps, strange silences. The way Mariah slipped out of the rhythm of life as if she were erasing her own footprints. Abby knew Mariah better than most, not because Abby could read her mind, but because she had seen Mariah fight her shadows before. She had watched Mariah try to do right in a world that always punished her for her past. And Abby knew one brutal truth: when Mariah stayed quiet for too long, it was never peace. Abby was torn between hope and fear. Part of her wanted to believe Mariah simply needed time, space, a quiet night to gather herself. But Abby's instincts wouldn't let her lie to herself for long. Every time Abby looked at Dominic, her chest tightened with the thought that Mariah might be somewhere alone, standing on the edge of a moment so thin it could snap with one more push. Abby realized she was racing something invisible, fighting a war where the enemy left no footprints. And because she didn't know where Mariah was or what she was thinking, Abby's fear sharpened into something almost physical. She began searching in the dark, without a map, without clear only intuition and the fierce, protective love she carried for Dominic and the deep, complicated bond she had with Mariah even when she refused to call it guaranteed. Abby reached out to the people closest to Mariah, trying to stitch scraps of information into a picture that could point her in the right direction. But there was little to collect. Because Mariah had done what desperate people often do, she shrank inward, minimized signs, avoided letting anyone see how far she was falling. The lack of answers made Abby more frightened, because it suggested one terrifying possibility: Mariah hadn't simply wandered off. She had chosen to disappear. Abby refused to let herself collapse, because every minute that passed was a minute she was gambling with something that could not be undone. She searched the places Mariah might have mentioned. The corners Mariah used to hide in when she needed to breathe. The quiet edges of town where someone could vanish without anyone noticing. Abby wasn't searching with logic alone. She was searching with memory, with habit, with the ability to remember Mariah's eyes in her weakest moments. For Mariah, the decision didn't arrive like a dramatic explosion. It arrived like a long silence that grew heavier, darker, more convincing. She found a place that was empty and isolated, not because she wanted attention, but because she wanted everything to end in quiet, as if quiet could make the damage smaller. That was the twisted thinking Ian cultivated, turning pain into ritual, despair into solution. Mariah's disappearance into a gift. Ian stayed with her like a shadow that refused to detach, giving her no space to recover. He insisted she had tried long enough, fought long enough, that this battle could not be won by continuing to exist. And when Mariah was exhausted, shaking, hollow, barely recognizing herself, as seduction began to feel like tenderness. Mariah didn't want to leave Dominic behind, but Ian convinced her Dominic would be safer without her. She imagined Dominic's future as a beam of light she didn't deserve to touch. She pictured him growing up free of the instability she carried, free of the darkness that hovered around her. Mariah placed herself in the role of the danger, then punished herself as proof that she still loved her son. That was Ian's real cruelty. He turned love into evidence against her, forcing her to believe the only way to protect Dominic was to remove herself from his life forever. And once Mariah almost fully believed that story, she began preparing for the worst, like someone surrendering to a conclusion that felt inevitable. Abby, in her breathless race, clung to a small sign other people might have ignored. It could have been a habit, a route, a familiar place, nothing subtle but enough to make Abby believe it wasn't random. Abby didn't have the luxury of certainty. She only had a mother's instincts and the terror of someone who had seen too many lives shatter in an instant. She chased that feeling as if she could outrun fate itself. Every minute felt like an accusation. If Abby slowed down, hesitated, convinced herself things were fine, she might lose Mariah forever, and Dominic would grow up with an absence that could never be filled. When Abby finally found Mariah, time seemed to choke. Everything moved too fast and too slow at once. Abby saw Mariah in a state so fragile it was terrifying, not the fragility of loud sobbing, but the fragility of someone who had quieted every sound inside her, until only one cold decision remained. Abby couldn't hear what Ian was saying at that exact moment, but she could see the imprint of it on Mariah's face, eyes pulled toward a distant place, focus sharpened to danger. The feeling that Mariah stood at the edge and had already decided to step. Abby knew that one wrong move, one burst of panic, could make everything collapse in front of her. Abby tried to break the hallucination by dragging Mariah back into the present, with everything she had, without turning it into confrontation. Abby couldn't argue with Ian because Ian wasn't truly there to debate. Abby could only reach for the part of Mariah still alive, the part that was Dominic's mother, the part that still knew how to love, the part that still knew fear. And Abby could feel the war inside Mariah. On one side, Ian's whispers move, merciless. On the other, the call of life, of Dominic, of survival flickering weakly but not extinguished. Mariah trembled, not from cold but from being split in two by opposing forces. Some seconds, she looked ready to let go just to be quiet inside. Other seconds, her eyes wavered as if she'd remembered something essential. Dominic didn't need a gift of his mother's disappearance. Dominic needed his mother to stay, even imperfect, even frightened. The hallucination didn't vanish the moment Abby appeared. It reacted like a predator robbed of its prey. Ian shifted tactics. No longer seducing Mariah with peace but poisoning her with fear. Abby had come to stop the mission. Abby would never understand. Abby would make it worse. Abby would take Dominic away. Those thoughts struck Mariah's deepest drawer. Being seen as dangerous, being stripped of motherhood, having her love turned into proof against her. Mariah jolted back toward the edge, her eyes darkening. And Abby felt herself standing in front of a door that could slam shut at any second. Abby had to hold Mariah steady without making her feel trapped, because Mariah had lived too long with the sensation of being cornered, until only one option remained. The turning point didn't arrive with a loud, triumphant gesture. It arrived with a shift in Mariah's gaze, barely a tremor when she reached for Dominic. In a different way, Dominic stopped being the excuse to end everything and became the reason to endure one more day. Ian still pulled at her and the dark call still echoed, but the supposed nobility of it began to crack. Mariah started to sense that Ian's sacred language was really a cage, and that cage only opened in one direction, toward self-destructs. That realization didn't heal her, but it fractured the conclusion that death was the only answer. And in a war like this, a crack can be enough to let light in. Abby sensed that tiny shift, like someone standing in a storm who suddenly feels the wind change. She didn't dare breathe too hard or let her emotions become pressure. She knew Mariah could still fall back at any moment. Abby focused on keeping Mariah in the present, keeping her here right now, where Dominic still waited. Abby tried to let Mariah feel that her existence was not a threat, that her love was not a crime, that staying alive was the single strongest way to keep Dominic safe. But the harsh truth remained, even if Mariah stepped back from the edge. Even if Abby arrived in time, Ian's shadow was not destroyed. It had only retreated like a predator that knew how to wait. Mariah was pulled away from the cliff, but not out of the battle. Even beside Abby, even while forcing herself to breathe like a human again, she could still hear Ian's residue like an echo down a long hallway. The echo made her fear herself, fear that if Abby looked away for a second, she would be dragged back. Mariah felt ashamed for coming that close, guilty for letting Dominic become the weak point Ian could exploit, bitter that even motherhood could be twisted into a weapon. Abby wasn't truly calm either. Abby understood that finding Mariah was only the surface of the race. The deeper terror was what Abby couldn't grab and pull away, an invisible Ian, living in the cracks of Mariah's mind, capable of returning stronger after one long night. And just when Abby thought she had stopped the worst outcome, a colder thought cut through them both. If Ian's hallucination could guide Mariah all the way here, if it could convince her death was released, what would it do next after being interrupted? Mariah looked at Abby not only as someone rescued, but as someone who had just realized her life had become a battlefield, and the enemy wouldn't stop out of mercy. Abby held that truth like a bomb that hadn't detonated yet, because Dominic was at the center of everything. And if Ian could find a new way to turn Dominic into bait, they would be forced to run again. The moment didn't end with safety. It ended with dread, because the war had not ended at the cliff's edge. It had only begun to change shape, and Abby felt it in her bones as her phone vibrated with a new alert connected to Dominic. As if fate had only just started counting down. Sharon didn't step into that moment like an ordinary mother coming home after a long day. She stepped into it like someone who had lived too long with the instinct that tragedy never announces itself with noise, it arrives as an unnatural silence. In Genoa City, there are days when everything still looks normal, familiar streets, familiar rooms, lamps casting their soft glow, but Sharon had learned to read the gaps in the air, the sudden chill in her palms, the spike in her heartbeat with no clear reason. And today, even before she saw Mariah, Sharon felt as if she were being pulled toward something collapsing nearby. The stillness, no footsteps, no small everyday sounds, no sign of life moving through space, tightened every sense in her body like a drawn wire. She called her daughter's name in her mind with a panic she tried to swallow down, as if even thinking it could make the horror more real, heavier, irreversible. When Sharon saw Mariah lying unconscious, time cracked. It didn't flow anymore, it stopped, then shattered into sharp fragments that cut through every thought. Mariah was there, unresponsive, motionless, without the smallest resistance, like the living part of her had been stripped away. In a moment no one witnessed, Sharon didn't scream the way movies teach people to. She didn't immediately collapse into loud sobs, because her mind refused to release emotion before it processed the reality in front of her. What she felt instead was a cold wave up her spine, a brutal clamp around her throat that turned air into something thick and difficult, and a weakness in her knees that threatened to drop. Parental instinct held her upright. That instinct was both merciless and saving. It wouldn't allow Sharon to fall apart, because if she fell apart, who would keep Mariah tethered to life? Questions hit all at once, out of order, merciless, with nowhere to go. What is happening to her? What did Mariah go through before she collapsed? Why now? When everything has been stretched to the breaking point by the shadows circling Ian Ward and the darkness that never truly leaves this family? Sharon couldn't separate Mariah from the larger storm swallowing Genoa City. A place where obsessions don't die, the only change shape, change strategy. Ian Ward, even as a name, was an open wound in Sharon's memory, someone who once poured poison into minds, someone who twisted trust and love until they became weapons. Sharon looked at Mariah lying there and felt the past returning, not to warn them, but to drown them all over again. Sharon's panic wasn't a cry. It was an explosion of responsibility. In her mind, every image of Maria, every time she forced herself to cope, every time she said she was fine, every time she hid a tremor, every time she stayed silent too long, snapped together into a chain of warnings. Sharon could have understood sooner if she had stopped accepting "I'm okay" as proof. Sharon realized the most dangerous threats in a family aren't always the public confrontations. Sometimes they're the quiet suffering, the cracks no one sees until the whole structure caves in. Mariah had always been strong in a particular way. She endured, she analyzed herself. She backed into corners alone, terrified of being a burden, terrified of hurting the people she loved. And inside that fear, she could have slipped into a darkness no one could reach in time. Sharon leaned closer not because she expected answers, but because she needed to force herself to believe Mariah was still here. She studied her daughter's face, so familiar yet suddenly strange without expression. And her heart tightened around a brutal truth. There are moments when love is not enough to protect someone from themselves, from the shadows in their own mind, from invisible enemies that outsiders only recognize when it's already too late. Sharon didn't know whether Mariah had collapsed from exhaustion, a psychological break, or something else entirely, but she knew this was not a small incident they could brush aside. This was the sign of a war that had escalated so far the body couldn't carry it anymore. In that instant, Sharon felt a double fear. The first was primal fear of losing her child. The second was more refined and more painful, the fear that something had gotten inside Mariah. In a way Sharon could not control, the way Ian Ward once did with others, not by touching them, but by bending their thoughts, planting false beliefs, turning vulnerability into guilt, turning despair into the right choice. Sharon understood Ian Ward like a mental plague, and even the faintest mention of him made her lungs tighten. She hated the possibility that Mariah had been dragged back toward that void, where reassurance becomes meaningless and every outstretched hand can be misunderstood as a shackle. Sharon blamed herself, but not in a melodramatic way. It was the self-blame of a mother who understood that love cannot be only emotion. Love is vigilance, the willingness to read warning signs early, the courage to be difficult enough to ask harder questions, to check again, to stay a little longer when your child says they want to be alone. Sharon had believed Mariah was trying, that she would push through like she always had, that time and gentleness would be enough. But Genoa City grants no one the privilege of lasting peace. And people like Maria Heeple, carrying too many old wounds, often become the first targets of new storms. The air around Sharon thickened, as if even the room was holding its breath. Every trivial detail, light, sound, scent became evidence Sharon tried to cling to, trying to build a cause out of fragments. Mariah's unconsciousness wasn't only a physical state. It felt like a terrifying symbol of how far she had been pushed. Sharon thought about the tension, the rumors, the pressure revolving around Dominic, around Abby, around the lingering spiral connected to Ian Ward. She didn't need anyone to say it out loud to understand. If Dominic was the center of the storm, then Mariah was the most vulnerable point. Because her love for him ran deep, and deep love is easily twisted into deep fear. And fear, when exploited by something like Ian, even only as an echo, can become a machine that grinds down the will to survive. In Sharon's mind, Dominic appeared like a blinking light. He wasn't here, but his existence felt like an invisible thread tying everyone together, making any shift in Mariah ripple outward into consequences no one could escape. Sharon sensed it instinctively. If Mariah woke up drowning in panic or guilt, if she believed she was dangerous to Dominic, then every attempt to keep the family stable would become another battle, this time a battle to pull Mariah back from her own thoughts. Sharon had never feared an enemy simply because he was strong. Sharon feared enemies who knew how to turn love into a weakness, and Ian Ward had always been exactly that, in whatever form he returned. Mariah lay still, and Sharon felt as if she were standing between two worlds, one where Mariah was still the woman who could stand up, say I'm fine, smile just to comfort others, and another where Mariah had slipped beyond reach, where Sharon had to accept that some pain cannot be healed with words, only saved by action taken in time. But what action? Sharon didn't have the answer yet. She only knew that every second passing was terrifying, because unconsciousness is a brutal silence. It doesn't tell Sharon where Mariah is inside her own mind, whether she's still fighting, or whether she has already let go, whether she's being dragged by darkness or held by the last thin thread of light. Helplessness was what Sharon hated most, because it dragged her back to every time she had watched someone she loved slip from her grasp, for reasons she could not control. Sharon had stood in too many moments like this, each one leaving a new scar. Each one teaching her that just wait a little longer can sometimes be the fatal mistake. But because Sharon had lived through so much, she also knew blind panic wouldn't save Mariah. Sharon forced herself to stay steady even as she broke apart inside. She forced herself to notice the smallest signs. Because sometimes life and death are divided by details that seem meaningless until they aren't. And then, as Sharon looked more closely, she realized what frightened her most wasn't only that Mariah was unconscious, but the way Mariah seemed to have gone dark after a lonely war no one saw. Sharon felt it like an accusation against the entire family. Had Mariah been screaming silently, while no one heard? Had she been cornered while everyone assumed she was simply quiet? This silence felt like a message, as if Mariah's body had finally spoken for her, ripping the curtain away and forcing the truth into the open. Mariah wasn't okay. She hadn't been okay for a long time. And what was happening could not be fixed with "stay strong or it will be fine." Sharon suddenly thought of Abby not as someone entering the room, but as part of the emotional web Sharon couldn't ignore. Abby and Mariah, Dominic, and the tension around them. All of it felt like cords pulled so tight that one vibration could snap them. Sharon knew Abby was being dragged into this storm in her own way. But Sharon didn't have time to unravel everything. In front of her, only Mariah existed. And one burning question blazed in Sharon's mind. Is this the aftermath of a battle in Mariah's mind that she lost, at least for now? Or is it the sign that Ian Ward's darkness has found a way back in the most terrifying way possible, without showing his face, simply destroying a person from the inside out? Sharon's throat burned as she swallowed down a sob, but she refused to drown in emotion. If she collapsed here, Mariah would truly be alone. Sharon had once been the fragile one, the one controlled by the past, the one who couldn't tell real fear from fear born of obsession. That was exactly why Sharon understood what might be happening to Mariah when the mind is distorted. You don't need an enemy to attack you, become your own enemy. Ian Ward wouldn't have to lift a finger if Mariah had begun to believe she didn't deserve to live, didn't deserve to be a mother, didn't deserve to be loved. Sharon looked at Mariah and saw, inside that unconscious stillness, a toxic moral war, a woman who loves her child so fiercely she might vanish, because she believes that is how she protects him. Sharon's fear slowly hardened into a cold determination. She couldn't fight inside Mariah's mind for her, but she could become the barrier between Mariah and the cliff's edge. Sharon knew the moments after Mariah Wakif she woke would matter just as much as this moment, because the most dangerous enemy wasn't the collapse itself. It was what would rush in when Mariah opened her eyes: shame, confusion, guilt, and that familiar voice trying to retell the story that Mariah is a threat. Sharon prepared for it like a soldier, even though she was just a mother trembling beside her child. The room stayed quiet, but it wasn't ordinary quiet anymore. It felt like the pause before a final door slammed shut. Sharon sensed something unsaid hanging in the air, a larger question. How far had Mariah gone before she fell? What had she heard in her mind? What had she believed so deeply that her body shut down to stop it? Sharon didn't have answers, and the absence of answers terrified her more than any explanation could. Because if this were only exhaustion, Sharon could still cling to the hope of recovery. But if this was the sign of manipulation so deep Mariah had started destroying herself, then Sharon understood they were facing a longer, darker, more brutal war. Sharon stared at Mariah again, as if engraving this moment into memory, not for pain, but as a vow never to ignore the signs again. Her heart hammered. But the pounding wasn't pure panic anymore. It was the rhythm of someone who had just realized the truth has reached the point of no denial. Mariah didn't just need to be found. Mariah needed to be held here. And Sharon knew, in this town, holding someone to life can be harder than finding where they disappeared. The hook didn't come with a new event. It came with a realization that turned Sharon cold. If Mariah collapsed here, after days of being pushed to the edge, then the most terrifying part might not be the moment she fell, but the moment she opens her eyes and finally says what made her let go, because Sharon understood Mariah may not have gone down from exhaustion at all. She may have gone down because she believed she must disappear for Dominic to be safe. And if that belief has rooted itself deep enough, then this awakening won't end the nightmare. It will be the moment the nightmare finally speaks out loud. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.